In this tutorial, we'll be using Photoshop to change some images that are a little bit underexposed. You can see how it's a bit dark here on the sides. We'll be changing that, changing the brightness and the contrast, and also changing the color balance, so making it look less warm or maybe a little bit cooler. And we have a few images to choose from. We have this one with a woman in a street, we have an alley street scene, and we have this city scene as well. So the first photo we're going to use is the one with the woman in the street, so we'll open that up in Photoshop. Here's our image here, and we have one layer, which is our background, and you can see that it's at about 25%, so this is a high quality image. If I zoom in using Command plus and minus or Control plus and minus on PC, up to 100%, you can see that our image is high quality. This is something that I recommend you use whenever you're working with the images. Make sure they're high quality. So there are ways to brighten an image and bring out the depth and the contrast within it. And there are ways to do it destructively, which means you actually alter the image, or non-destructively. And we're going to do the non-destructive. And what that means is you can make changes and at any time go back and adjust them so you don't actually destroy your original file. Down below the layer stack, you'll see this little button here. If you click that, you'll have these options. These are all layer adjustments, and these will be applied above this background layer. So for the first one, let's click on Levels. You'll notice that we get this layer above our background image, and this is what an adjustment layer looks like. It has this box window here and this little half-cut circle. You can turn it on and off easily. With making this adjustment layer, it's going to affect anything that's underneath it. In our property window, you can see that we have these adjustment windows. This slider on the left affects the blacks, the one in the middle affects the midtones, and the one on the right affects all the highlights. So watch as I click and slide this lower one, which is for the blacks. If I slide this to the right, you can see in the image, it makes more of the image black. I'll put it back to where it was. Let's slide the right one, which is the highlights. I'll move this to the left, and you'll notice that the image starts to get brighter, with the brightest points starting to blow out. I'll move it back to the right. The middle one is for the midtones. If I move this left or right, you'll see that it brightens everything in the image without blowing out too much. If I move it to the right, it darkens up a lot of the image, but it doesn't make everything strong black yet. So if at any point you've made some changes and you want to undo them, there's the reset button here, and you can just click that once, and it returns everything to its base state. So to explain what we're doing here with these sliders, I'm going to open up a different file that I've prepared. And I'll paste this into our image. So what this is a range of shades from black all the way up to pure white. First I'm going to change the black sliders. As I move this slider to the right, you'll see that it's making more of the bars black. Now I'll use the white slider. I'll slide this to the left, and you'll see that it's taking all of these very faint gray bars and making them pure white. So that black and white slider, they're very harsh and they give it contrast. The slider in the middle is the midtones. If I slide that to the left, you'll see that it makes everything just that little bit brighter, but we can still see the contrast and difference between the bars. If I move it to the right, everything becomes darker, but once again, you can still see the contrast. So that shows you that the ones on the outside, the black and the white, will do some good contrasting and making more things bright and more things dark. But the one in the middle will do subtle changes across the whole image. Okay, so I'll turn off that layer. Let's use our levels to make these changes. I'm going to hit the reset button so everything's back to normal. And first what I'd like to do is, let's brighten up the image by just using the middle slider. If I move it to the right, you see that it darkens. If I move it up to the left, it brightens up. Let's go about there. And now I'm just trusting my eye. This is just all about experimentation and seeing what you think looks good. Now let's slide my blacks. Let's move these to the right. So what this is doing is making the darker areas of the image black. Move that back a little bit. And now let's brighten up the whites. I take the white slider and bring it to the left. And you'll notice if I bring it up too far, her face starts to get blown out and you lose all of the detail. So you want to watch that. Let's make it about there. So I've made some changes and it's interesting to see what it was like before. So to turn off the adjustment layer, hit the eye icon and you can see what the photo was like before. So you can see that we've added a fair amount of contrast to our photo. It's made the details pop and it's actually made her stand out from the background a little bit more. Another adjustment layer we'll use, click down here for the adjustment layers, and click Color Balance. Color Balance is now a new adjustment layer, and you see that our sliders have now changed to these color sliders. So I'm just going to experiment. I'm going to click on the cyan and red slider, and move it to the left, and you'll see that it adds a bit more of the cyan blue color. If I move it to the right, it warms up our image and makes it nice and red. So I'm going to put mine up to the red here a little bit. Now I'll go to the next one and I'll slide down to magenta. That makes it a little bit purpley. If I move it to the right, it adds a bit more green. I'm going to keep it a little bit purple. Now I'll use my yellow and blue slider. Yellow warms it up a bit more. Blue makes it a little bit colder. Let's go about there. Now to check how the changes have been done, let's hit the eye on our color balance image adjustment layer. And you can see that the differences are pretty stark. Originally, the image was a bit blue and a bit colder, but my adjustment layer now has warmed up the image. So this shows you that the same image can actually have a lot of color balance adjustments made. And if at any point you want to undo your color changes, you can hit the reset button, you can go in and change your sliders, and you can also hit the delete button to delete your adjustment layer. So let's save our image, File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as a Photoshop file because I want to be able to edit this later. Woman on street, make sure it's the Photoshop format and that you have layers ticked. And click Save. And OK. And now let's save this as a JPEG. File, Export, Export As. In this pop-up window, change your format to be JPEG. And since this is a high quality image, this is only 25% of the original size. So let's change our image size to be 25%. Go over to the right, type in 25 and hit return. And now you can press the zoom button to zoom up to 100%, and this is how big our image will be. The quality, let's make this about 70%. We don't need it to be full quality. And then hit Export All. And I'll call this Woman on Street Edit. Click Save. Now we can go back to our folder, open up our two images, so you can see the differences between the before image and the after image. This image is much warmer, which means it has more reds and oranges in the image. This one's a lot cooler. It has greens and blues. Now everything is preferential, it's all subjective, so you can experiment with these adjustments within Photoshop to change the photo into different end results. Let's run the exercise one more time with another image. We'll choose this alley photo. Open that in Photoshop. Now first off, let's apply our Levels adjustment layer. Click down here and click Levels. And you'll notice that we get our properties with all of our sliders. Now you can see that this image is very dark, so let's brighten it a little bit. Another way you can do this is you can actually click the Auto button. The Auto button, Photoshop will analyze the image and it will change the sliders to balance the photo out to what it thinks suits. So if you don't want to experiment and you just want some quick results, you can always click the Auto button. But I want to do this by hand, so I'll hit the Reset button. All of my level sliders are back to normal, and now let's start experimenting. I'll slide the middle slider. Let's brighten our image a bit. And you can see the brighter you go, you can see all of the detail that was hidden in the shadows. Let's brighten it up. And now I'll use my highlight slider, or the white slider, bring that to the left, and you'll see that it starts to brighten all of the light areas. If you go too far, it blows out the details. So let's bring it back to the right so we still have some details. And now let's slide the dark slider up to the right. And that starts to make our blacks really rich and black. So now to check the results and the progress of the layer, let's turn on and off the adjustment layer. You can see how dull and dark the original was, and very flat with the contrast. We brought up the contrast, brought up the midtones and the highlights, and the scene seems a little bit more detailed. But this scene looks a little bit too blue and cold for me. Let's do some color balancing. I'll click on the adjustment layer button and click on color balance, and we have our color balance adjustment layer here. And if I look at this image, I can see that there's a lot of blues and greens. So I'm going to go over here to my blues and greens sliders and move them away from the blues and greens. I'll do the first one, slide it to the right, and immediately you can see that my image is warming up. If I go all the way to the right, the image is very warm. That's probably a little bit too much, so I'll keep it about there. Now let's move away from the green and go to the left, probably a little bit there. And then the yellow and the blue, if I move it towards the blue, you can see the image gets cooler, but let's move it to the left like that. About there. So I'll keep my sliders there, and I want to see how it looks compared to the original image. So I'll click the eye icon, and when you've done changes like this, it shows you just how different the original image was. The original was much bluer, it was colder, it feels like it's a cold night in the street. But with our adjustments, this now feels like a warm summer night. So it's all subjective. You may want a warmer photo, you may want a bluer, colder photo. You can do all of these changes with your adjustment layers. One final detail you can do when using your color balance is you'll notice the tone is affecting the midtones. You can also change the shadows and the highlights. So say I went to my shadows. Now these sliders will only be affecting the darkest parts of the image. So let's say I want to make these shadows very blue. Let's go to my blue slider, slide it up, and then I'll go to the top one to slide this back. And you'll see now that all of our shadows are very dark and blue. We still have some warmth in the midtones here. I'll undo that. If I go to my highlights, now these sliders will be affecting the bright parts of the photo. So keep an eye on these spots up here. I'm going to make those blue. You'll see that especially this light here on the wall, as I change the color, goes to blue. The rest of the image still has some warmth in it. So this is something to keep in mind when you're making some changes. You can also get very specific and choose which area of the image you're changing with your color balance. But for the first time, stick with the midtones, and that will affect the overall image in a nice balanced way. So let's save this image. As always, save it as a Photoshop file first. Alley street scene. And now let's export this. And you can see that our image is full screen and we're only at 25%. That's because this original image is high quality. So let's change the scale to be 25%. We'll shrink this image down a little bit. And now let's zoom until this says 100%. This is the size that our final image will be. That's looking good. I'll set the quality to 70% and also double check that the format is JPEG. Let's hit Export All. Alley Street Scene, Edit. And let's compare the original photos. So we have our two photos here with the original on the left and the edit on the right. You can see that the right has a lot more contrast. You can see the details in the walls, in the pavers, in the street texture, and it's also a lot warmer. So once again, it's subjective. You can experiment with the color balance and the levels adjustment layers and see what you can bring out of your photos.